Try again. It is very nice to be invited to talk at this meeting. I'm very sorry I'm not there in person. I'm also very sorry that I cannot speak in Spanish. My apologies for that. When I was told that the theme of the conference was to do with students and teachers in the community, I very much felt that this was a subject in which I have personally a great deal of interest. I'm going to divide my talk into 5 parts. First, a brief introduction to the World Federation for Medical Education, which many of you will know, but a few may not. I will then talk about teaching and clinical practice of medical students in the community. Then medical students as drivers of education, and then students and the quality of education. And I will end with a request for 3 very particular things. So to enlarge on that a little bit, in the introduction to the World Federation, a thing I will particularly mention, although I do not always do, is that the PAFAMs had a prominent role in the beginning of the World Federation. When talking about students in the community, in their role in clinical practice and how they learn there and how they are taught there, I will give some examples from many countries in Europe, in Africa, in Australia, elsewhere. As drivers in education, students have a lot of influence on educational methods and content, and I think there are national and international organizations that are particularly effective in promoting that. There is a history for the extent to which students have influenced the quality of education, and they certainly have a very considerable influence in many jurisdictions. And I will talk about the improvement, the quality of education, particularly the World Federation accreditation program in the Americas. And finally, as I say, I have a request for 3 things at the end. Now, the role of the World Federation is aims to enhance the quality of medical education and promote high standards worldwide. Sorry, call that back. And it is a partnership organization of the 6 regional associations for medical education, and it also works with its founding members, the World Health Organization, the World Medical Association, and it has 3 other members of the executive, the Junior Doctors Network, the International Federation of Medical Students Associations, and the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates. It was founded in 1972, primarily by the World Medical Association and WHO, but PAFAMS was a very active regional association at that time already and was very prominent in developing the World Federation. Also at the start, there was the Association for Medical Education in Europe, but their support was less strong. Their president at the time was Henry Walton, who was worried that the World Federation would take all the money from the Association for Medical Education in Europe. Things evolved rather differently than that. We have 3 main priorities: the promotion of accreditation through the recognition program, raising the standards for basic medical education, postgraduate education, continuing professional development, and distributed learning. And we maintain the World Directory of Medical Schools jointly with our colleagues in FEMA. And we always put this disclaimer in: we're not concerned with the detail of education, what is actually in the curriculum, or what kind of educational method you use, and so on. It's much more to do with how good education is, how it is run, how it's organized, how it's funded, how it fits in with the political system, and so on. The Executive Council is the governing body of the World Federation, and you can see here it is when it last met face-to-face in Seoul, now nearly 3 years ago. The members include the World Medical Association, the World Health Organization, ECFMG, and IFMSA, the medical students. The medical student is the one sitting in the middle of the front row. Medical students usually provide a lot of the common sense at the meetings of the WFME Council. That's as it looked when it last met face-to-face, but this is as it looks when it last met on the screen, and that was one of the rare occasions when we had absolutely everybody there. And you could see how we spread across the world, from the Czech Republic top left to Singapore bottom right, or from Indonesia and the United States on the left, and Mexico and Nigeria on the right. And this is the front page of our website, and all the information is there. The web address is very easy, wfme.org, and there's an administration address where you can write and ask anything. Now, to talk about students learning in the community and what do they contribute to clinical practice there. This is a subject which fascinates me because views on it are so very varied. Our office is in France, as many of you will know, and if you ask the dean of a French medical school whether his or her students can go and learn in the community in primary care or similar, and the dean will say, it is not possible. That would be completely impossible. However, if you ask the dean of a medical school in the UK, the reply will be, of course. When I was the dean of the medical school of the University of Manchester, sitting just here, between us and the medical school of the University of Liverpool, we sent students to every single hospital in the whole of the northwest of England, that area that you see there. And from Manchester, we also sent students to 300 different primary care practices. So that meant that students were spending a very great deal of time actually in the community and learning, we believe, very effectively. Now, there are many, many different views, as I say, and perhaps even more extreme than France is the view in Germany, where the question may well be not, is the community good enough for students? It may be, is the hospital good enough? This is a picture of the large hospital in Nuremberg, and this is a very substantial metropolitan area with a population effectively of 800,000 people. But there is no medical school in Nuremberg. Why not? If you ask colleagues in Berlin, they say the hospital is not good enough for medical students. The question I've asked several times is, if the hospital is not good enough for medical students, is it good enough for the people of Nuremberg? Surely there must be a hospital that is of adequate quality for a conurbation of such size. And if it's of appropriate standard in that community, surely it would be of appropriate standard for students to study. It's still very difficult to picture a non-teaching hospital teaching students, let alone students learning in the community. Elsewhere in the world, the British model is followed much more than the French or the German one. Here, for example, is the hospital of the James Cook Medical School in the north of Australia, northern Queensland. But although there is a hospital, this is a medical school designed specifically for students primarily to learn in the community. And the dean, one of the early deans of the Cook School, actually even wrote a textbook about the practice of medicine in the countryside in Australia. And this is seriously learning in the community. If you're a medical student at the James Cook Hospital and you're on a community placement, to get to your patient, you may well need to fly there. It is just too far to do it any other way. This is the Australian Flying Doctor Service. And similarly in Africa, this is the Walter Sisulu Medical School in South Africa. You can see a medical school building in the background, but again, as in the James Cook School in Australia, these students primarily study in the community rather than in the hospital. And another African example, this is a ward round in the community in a medical school in the Sudan. So it is certainly possible. What kind of contribution does the presence of students make to the process of learning in the community? Well, I would argue that there are two effects. One is that once you have students out in the community, where after all, most of them will spend their professional lives, then the curriculum will inevitably have more of the content that is relevant to that area of clinical practice, the real world of clinical practice. in the community. The second point is that methods of education, the methods, pedagogical methods, are inevitably different if the medical school is distributed, not distant, but distributed actually out into the community. And thanks to a meeting we had now nearly 2 years ago, we have standards, the World Federation standards for distributed and distance learning in medical education. And this was written by a large team and has now been published. It's available on our website. And it helps us understand the theory and practice of delivering education at a distance when students, but not just students, but their teachers as well, are actually distributed out into the community. The initiative for this came from a meeting we held in June, nearly 2 years ago, when the community explained to us that there was a worry about the pandemic. How would it affect the accreditation of medical schools? How would it affect standards for learning? How would it affect the World Federation recognition program? And you can see that the panelists were from the UK, from the United States, from Iran, and from Australia. And the element of that seminar that attracted the most interest by far was the discussion about distance and distributed learning. And Professor Grant, who used to work at the Open University in the UK, the world's biggest distributed learning university, led in the writing of those standards. I'll give you one other example of the way in which students in the community have had an influence not only on the community as a learning environment, but as in the delivery of healthcare in the community. This map shows Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Baltic countries. And the area here is the area of the Turku archipelago. Turku is the city at the bottom left-hand corner of Finland. And the archipelago of Turku is an area of absolutely astonishing beauty, islands stretching away and away into the sunset. In this picture, the islands look to be very small, but in fact, they are populated. They actually have quite a large population. But medical care in the islands is very difficult because doctors used not to want to go and work there. And there were a number of reasons. One is that although it's in Finland, these islands are predominantly Swedish speaking. And although Swedish is a national language in Finland, not all school children and students learn it very well. But a much more important factor is that people did not know what the islands were like and did not know what medical care was like. And so the University of Turku instituted a program, a voluntary program for its students to spend some time, an elective time, working in the healthcare system of the islands. It meant they had to make sure their Swedish was of a good standard, but not the kind of standard you speak in Sweden. It's a very different kind of Swedish language. But the effect is that of the students who went out to study there, there was a quite considerable proportion who really loved the life that they had discovered in the islands of the Turku archipelago. And the outcome now is that there is a steady flow of graduates from the medical school of the University of Turku who choose to work in the islands of the archipelago, and medical care across these remote islands is now of a very high quality because of the continuous flow of doctors going there. So a general example of a medical school meeting its social responsibility and creating something as a result of learning in the community. You'll notice that I used the word social responsibility rather than social accountability. Accountability is a word I find difficult, but in the French use of social accountability, they refer to social responsabilité, which I much prefer. So now the question of medical students as drivers of education in general. And it's difficult to absolutely prove that students have a big influence on educational methods and content, but I think there is some evidence. For example, in the curriculum that medical schools in the UK are required to follow, the curriculum set by the General Medical Council, there are elements called SSMs, Special Study Modules. And when the curriculum was revised, now nearly 30 years ago, it was agreed that much of the material could be cut down to allow for more space for students to choose subjects and go into them in more depth, or to study things that were not necessarily in the mainstream curriculum. And so, although they are called special study modules, they might also be called student-selected modules. And the outcome is that students are choosing to work in areas that are not as well covered by the general curriculum as they should be. Some are interested in special areas of surgery, others are interested in the legal system as it relates to medicine, and so on. So the students have a much broader development of the curriculum they follow. Nationally and internationally, there are, of course, bodies that are interested in medical education from the student perspective. And I particularly mention the International Federation of Medical Students Associations. In most of the countries of Latin America, there is a branch, a National Federation of Medical Students, which belongs to IFMSA. IFMSA is a very interesting organization because it is 70, or in fact 71 years old now, and the officers of the association are only in post for a year, or very rarely for 2 years at a time. The president is only 1 year at a time. The head of the education committee is only there for 1 year at a time. We have the representative who's there for liaison with medical education, and he or she is usually in post for 2 years because it's difficult to get a grip of it in just 1 year. But it's a subject for research by a business school, because how do you make an organization where almost the entire staff and the board change every year, and yet you have continuity right through 70 years, and continuity at a very effective organization? So here is a large IFMSA meeting, and you can see from the variety of flags and so on that it represents students really from all over the world. If you ever get an opportunity to go to an IFMSA International Congress, I urge you to do so. It's one of the most stimulating events in medical education that I know. Somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 medical students from all over the world together very intensively for a few days. And they don't work just by talking with each other. They have a committee structure that looks in depth and promotes a particular thing. So this is the Standing Committee on Medical Education. They were putting together a survival kit for a particular meeting in 2016. I chose this picture because this is actually the Mexican Medical Students Association. And as you will find if you go to the IFMSA website, they have 6 standing committees, not just looking at medical education and public health, but also running exchanges and looking at very important issues in healthcare and for the future of practice as the students will have to when they qualify. Reproductive health, human rights, they're concerned with climate change, and so on. So this is an effective and influential organization, and it has a substantial influence internationally. They are in official relations with not just the World Health Organization, but also with the United Nations. They regularly advance the student point of view and the student concern for good healthcare at the assemblies of both WHO and the United Nations. So the students in the community have a very profound effect, not just on the day-to-day practice of education, but on policy related to it. And we are very pleased officially to be associated with them. Now, the third of my bigger subjects is this one, which is to talk about the quality of education and the student influence on it. Formal regulation of medical practice or of medical education goes back to well over 100 years, 200 years, you could arguably longer. And the earliest examples of legislation you can find are from Australia, from the United Kingdom, not legislation, but the Flexner Report in the United States. And it's been argued by a colleague in Australia that medical regulation tends to be introduced at first in the is most needed. In other words, where doctors and medical students are the most lawless. And the foundation of bodies like the General Medical Council were initially concerned with the quality of care. It was concerned that the medical care was not as good as it should be. But when the Medical Council, the General Medical Council was started, it was called the General Medical Council for Education. In other words, making the point that you would get better medical care if you had better medical education. And within a few years of the General Medical Council being founded, almost half of all the medical schools in the UK closed, being of poor quality. That figure of about half is an interesting one. When Flexner wrote his report in the United States, after that report, about half of all the medical schools in the United States closed. Close to, in the Americas and close to Latin America is the Caribbean. And when the Caribbean Association for the Accreditation of Medicine and the Healthcare Professions, CAMHP, began work well over 10 years ago, they went into the business of starting to accredit medical schools in the Caribbean effectively. And the figure of half of the medical schools not being up to standard may well be correct. So when you start to look at quality of schools seriously, then bad schools can close fairly rapidly. And I'm interested that medical students in many countries are actively and sometimes officially, legally involved in quality assurance and accreditation. In the General Medical Council in the UK, every team that goes to accredit a medical school must have a medical student on the team. It would be unthinkable for the Liaison Committee for Medical Education in the United States or for the Australian Medical Council not to have medical student representation in its accreditation teams. You might argue from that that the World Federation would say that we would regard that as an essential of medical accreditation worldwide, but culturally that would not be possible. Some of my colleagues on the Executive Council of the World Federation have said we could not possibly allow medical students to be involved in accreditation. So we are working on it, but it will take time. Now, the recognition program for accrediting agencies, I'll say a little bit about that. Many of you will know, but it's a live subject. Why did it start? Well, it started because there was a need for improving accrediting agencies worldwide. And there were unacceptable, sometimes just to make money, accreditation systems. In one country, I won't say where, but we have reliable information that the Minister of Health will agree for accreditation of your medical school, provided you put $100,000 in his hand, and then he will issue the certificate. That's not a good way of verifying that medical schools are working well. And we have to have a process to measure the quality of medical schools. So we have to have a tool to do that, the accreditation process, and that has got to be accurate. And we always emphasize that the reason for accreditation of medical education is to enhance quality, to verify that medical schools are competent in delivery of education, that the programs are acceptable and suitable. And this is to ensure that schools are educating doctors fit to look after the people where they function, to serve the population. Now, there are many, many other reasons why we run the recognition program, and I won't go into those. the program's taken time to develop over more than the last 8 years. The initial advice was rather North American and European, so we're trying to make it a little bit more global in its feel. The timescale was wrong, and now we have a much better process for making decisions. The papers initially were very long, and we have actually made them more concise and more exact, and they're all available on the website. And we had to have many different things to work out. The assessors, we now have well over 40 from now more than 25 countries. They're trained, they have to be evaluated. We have travel policies, site visit policies, and so on. So many different things. And that's quite hard work to do when you're a tiny organization with a small staff, but I think we have it working reasonably well. In the Americas, there are perhaps one or two very specific issues, and I'll bring out two of them. One is that when we are recognizing an accrediting agency, we must make sure that that accrediting agency is really recognized in the country where it is working. Because if it is not recognized, then the accreditation process may be meaningless. If the accrediting agency says this school is so bad that it should close, it must mean that the school closes. And to enforce that, it will normally mean that the government itself recognizes the accrediting agency and acts on the recommendations of the accrediting agency. So we look to the eligibility of the accrediting agency to be assessed, and that will normally, indeed almost invariably, be that it's answerable either direct to the national government or to an organization that itself has authority from the national government. So, for example, in Poland, the medical chamber is responsible for the quality of medical schools, but the medical chamber answers to the government of Poland. And so if it did not close down a poor quality medical school, it would lose its role to do so. So we look very carefully at eligibility and that the outcome of an accreditation process really is effective. The other thing we are concerned about, and we worry a little bit about this in the Americas, but we worry about it in other parts of the world as well. It's important that accreditation is not done to give a particular medical school a badge or a medal or an award to say that this is a particularly good medical school. I'm interested in very good medical schools and fascinated at their distribution around the world, but the important thing in accreditation is not to just accredit a good medical school here and a good medical school there, but to accredit all the medical schools in a particular country or region or jurisdiction or whatever, to make sure that all those medical schools are at an acceptable standard. It's not just picking out the really good ones, it must be evaluating all the schools. Now, the recognition program recently, it has a process that you would expect. It's very similar to accreditation itself, to recognize accreditation, self-evaluation of the agency. We observe the accrediting agency at work. We've got a team out in Kazakhstan doing that at the moment, one going to Spain very soon. And the criteria that they must meet are actually set out in a paper that's on our website. Those criteria were based on a 2005 meeting jointly with the World Health Organization, and the criteria were brought up to date 3 or 4 years ago, and they're now in a steady state, we hope. So this is an accreditation team of the World Federation actually working in Japan, and it's a picture I particularly like because one team member on the right is from Sri Lanka, in the middle from the United States, but on the left is Professor Geneviève Moineau, who is talking at this meeting in a couple of hours' time, I believe. And one of the pleasing things about accreditation is when an agency says, "Thank you, you've been a partner in helping our development. We feel that we've been made better by the process as well as meeting the criteria." So we're aiming to help things improve, not just to pass the test. That's another site visiting team at work in Indonesia with a team member, same man from Sri Lanka, the team lead from Australia, a team member from the Czech Republic, and another one who can't be seen here from the United States. And Indonesia, just like Japan, just like many other countries, has an excellent accreditation system. The final decisions are now made not by anything within the office, but by an independent committee. One member from each region of the world, each of the WHO World Federation regions. So the representative from the Americas is, many of you will know, Dr. Centeno from Argentina. And whenever our team has evaluated an accrediting agency, their report goes independently to this independent recognition committee. And that's where the final decision is made. The current state, this is very slightly out of date, for which I apologize. Countries in dark blue have agencies that are allowed to work across the entire country. That's more meaningful, let's say, in the United States, where one agency covers the whole country, or Australia, similarly, or Egypt, similarly. In Russia, there's an accrediting agency that can work there, but we were hoping to assess another one which has more nationwide activity, but of course we cannot do so just at the moment. But you will see that there are areas of difficulty, Southeast Asia, where some of these countries are now actually in the system. They've asked us not to say that which ones are. In Europe, again, we've got a lot of activity there at the moment. Africa, where we have some progress, and then part of the Americas. And we very much hope that national accrediting bodies, such as exist in Argentina, in Colombia, and many other countries, will come to the World Federation for recognition in the near future, as well as other agencies active in the Americas who are already in the system. Just to share with you one slide which will amuse you, the presidents of the World Federation, I'm the last one to date, and you see from the dates that I finish this year. The university in each case is the last place where the president had an established post. Stefan Lindgren was in Lund, Hans Kahler, the University of Copenhagen. Henry Walton was at the University of Edinburgh. He's the person who said that the World Federation would take all the money from wfme. Not sure that that's quite the right outcome. But the first president was Professor Santos from Argentina. And there he is. That's the only picture we have got of him. If anyone has a better picture of Professor Santos, we would be very grateful. And that leads me on to my, I think, last slide, which is essentially a request for three things. The first is for information, in particular information for the World Directory of Medical Schools. As you know, we run this jointly with wfme, but if you know of medical schools in your country that should be in the directory, or indeed if there are medical schools in your country that are in the directory but don't actually exist, please let us know. We can't know miraculously. We need information, and people must please tell us. Secondly, Spanish can feel to be a neglected language. Of all the great world languages, that's the one where we in the World Federation Office, I think, are at the most deficient. And if there are papers on our website, whether they are actually sets of standards or reports or papers to do with the accreditation system, if you feel it would be helpful to have a translation into the Spanish language, then that can be arranged, certainly. And my third request is, as I come to the end of in my last few months as the president of the World Federation, I think we need in education to all the time do what we do based on fact as far as possible. Of course, we can't always have facts. Education is a social science rather than a hard science like molecular biology. So the evidence is very difficult to accumulate, but work on facts as far as possible and make no assumptions about what is going on. And I think we all of us need to work as a team everywhere. I'm struck sometimes by the way in which our very junior colleagues, the medical students, can be very effective at working as a team. And I'm sometimes also struck by the way that sometimes very senior people in education are very bad at team working. So that's my third request. act well in medical education. Let us know when we need translation, and give us plenty of information in information for the World Directory. Thank you. That's all I have to say, but I'm very pleased to answer any questions that there may be.
Agradecemos, por supuesto, al doctor Gordon por tan interesante forma de abordar el tema, por la reflexión y sin duda nos deja desafíos. Nos deja interesantes desafíos por asumir. A continuación, y siguiendo con el programa, los invitamos a acceder vía plataforma a las diversas salas virtuales para la presentación de trabajos libres. Me decían que no había tiempo. No sé. Por supuesto. Comentarios.
Nos puede escuchar. Nos puede escuchar.
Dr. David Gordon, it's a pleasure to listen to you now, and I will to ask you, what about is the future of international accreditation in America? In America, well, please.
Yes, well, let me say two things. First of all, the terminology. We are cautious of the word international accreditation, because exactly what does that mean? Does it mean accreditation of medical schools by a body from another country? Or does it mean accreditation of medical schools to an agreed international standard? And certainly that is one that we try and promote through the recognition program. What is the future of accreditation verified internationally in the Americas? Well, as you will have seen from the map that I showed, the accrediting functions in Canada, the United States, and COMIAM in Mexico are recognized by the World Federation. And we are also, the International Accreditation Institute is in the process of recognition, and that, of course, works in more than one country in the Americas. We have had contact with the relevant body in Colombia, and we very much hope that they will come in for recognition soon. The accreditation organization in Brazil has been recognized by the World Federation, but of course that's a problem with a huge number of medical schools to be assessed. We also have had contact with the accrediting authority in Argentina, and I hope they will come to us for recognition in the near future. But other accrediting agencies, whether operating in the region or operating in individual countries, we would be very pleased for them to come into the World Federation for recognition, and we would hope that they would be successful. I was very struck a couple of years ago when visiting the meeting of AMFEM I get my acronyms mixed up, of the association in Colombia, to find the standards for medical education in Colombia had a much longer history than the World Federation standards. In other words, the rest of the world in many ways is catching up with the Americas, and not just with North America, with Latin America. And I think the evidence that that's been effective is there in many countries. You know, there are actually long-standing, very efficient, well-run medical education systems in almost every country. So I think would be very good if the agencies that actually are active came to us for recognition, and that we would make that would help us make good progress. In the anticipation that that will happen, we have gradually been recruiting additional assessors who have the Spanish language, just because we don't normally send out an entire Spanish-speaking team, but we just about have enough almost to be able to do that. So we are, if you like, preparing for you.
Muchas gracias, doctor. Creo que queda contestada su...
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, doctor. Sí.
Por supuesto.
Bueno, agradezco la amabilidad de mi amigo David Gordon, de haber compartido sus experiencias en este tema tan interesante para todos nosotros. Y estaremos seguros de que la relación con la Federación Mundial continuará por muchos años más dentro de Pacam. Muchas gracias, David. Me da gusto saludarte y